The winter of 1942 pressed down on England like a suffocating shroud. In the basement of a cramped London townhouse, beneath the muffled sounds of air raid sirens and distant explosions, Professor Harold Finch hunched over a workbench cluttered with salvaged radio components, broken vacuum tubes, and strips of copper wire pulled from bombed-out buildings. His hands, stained with solder burns and grease, trembled slightly, not from cold, but from exhaustion and the weight of what he was attempting. Outside, the Battle of the Atlantic was bleeding Britain dry. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, sending thousands of tons of supplies and hundreds of Allied sailors to the bottom of the ocean every week. Convoys limped into port with half their ships missing. Children went hungry. Factories ran out of steel. Churchill himself had declared that the only thing that truly frightened him in this entire war was the U-boat peril. And yet, despite Britain's best efforts, despite radar stations dotting the coastline and destroyers racing across the waves, the submarines kept slipping through. Finch knew why. He'd seen the intelligence reports, read the captured German documents, studied the wreckage of downed Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes. The Nazis had developed something new, a detector that could sense when British radar was sweeping for them. It was called the METOX receiver, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. Whenever a U-boat's METOX picked up radar waves, the submarine would dive deep and slip away before Allied aircraft or ships could pinpoint its location. It was like hunting an enemy who could hear you coming from miles away. The Admiralty had thrown money at the problem. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment worked around the clock. But progress was maddeningly slow, bogged down in bureaucracy, committee meetings, and demands for proper procedures. Finch had attended 3 such meetings in as many weeks, watching valuable time evaporate into endless debates about funding, testing protocols, and chain of command. So he'd stopped attending. Instead, he'd returned to his basement with a wild idea and a truckload of scrap. The concept was deceptively simple. If the Germans could detect British radar, then the British needed radar that operated on a frequency the METOX couldn't hear. The problem was that building such a system from scratch would take years and resources Britain simply didn't have. But Finch wasn't thinking about building from scratch. He was thinking about modification, improvisation, repurposing. Every bombed building in London contained the raw materials of electronic warfare, radio sets, telephone equipment, electrical wiring. The city itself had become an enormous junkyard of components. His daughter Emma descended the stairs carrying a tray with tea and yesterday's bread. She was 17, sharp-eyed, and had become his unofficial assistant since the bombing that killed her mother 6 months earlier. She set the tray down carefully, navigating around coils of wire and glass tubes. "Still at it, Dad?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "The frequency modulation is all wrong," Finch muttered, not looking up. "The METOX is tuned to detect our standard 1.5-meter radar. But if I can jury-rig these components to generate a signal at 10 centimeters." He trailed off, making minute adjustments to a circuit board held together with electrical tape and prayer. "The ministry called again," Emma said quietly. "They want you back at the lab. Said this unauthorized project could get you dismissed." Finch's hands paused. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of anti-aircraft fire. Then he continued working, his voice tight. "Do you know how many ships we lost last month?" "I saw the newsreels." "The newsreels lie. They don't show you the real numbers because they'd cause panic." He finally looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed and fierce. 96 ships. Over 500,000 tons of cargo. Thousands of men burned or drowned or frozen to death in the North Atlantic. And every day we spend following proper procedures is another day those U-boats hunt freely. Emma had inherited her father's stubbornness. "And if this doesn't work? Then I'll have wasted some scrap metal and my career." He turned back to his workbench. "But if it does work?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implications hung in the air between them, as tangible as the smell of hot solder and aging electronics. The device taking shape on his bench looked like something from a madman's fever dream. A gutted radio receiver formed its heart, surrounded by a constellation of mismatched components. Vacuum tubes from a destroyed cinema's sound system, capacitors salvaged from a bombed telephone exchange, wire coils hand-wound around ceramic insulators he'd pulled from a collapsed power substation. There was no elegance to it, no clean engineering. It was brutal, improvised, held together by desperation and intuition. But Finch had spent 30 years studying electromagnetic theory. He understood wave propagation, frequency modulation, signal detection. And more importantly, he understood that sometimes the best solution wasn't the prettiest one, it was the one that worked. "Hand me that oscillator," he said, pointing to a component on the shelf. Emma complied, watching as he carefully integrated it into the circuit. "The Germans think they're safe because they can hear us coming. But sound at different frequencies. It's like speaking different languages. Their Metox is listening for one conversation. We just need to start speaking in another language entirely." The tea grew cold as father and daughter worked through the night. Above them, the war continued its relentless grinding. Somewhere in the Atlantic, another convoy steamed toward Britain, unaware of the wolves circling beneath the waves. Somewhere, U-boat commanders studied their Metox receivers with satisfaction, confident in their technological edge. And somewhere in the corridors of German naval intelligence, officers congratulated themselves on their impregnable detection system. None of them knew about the man in the basement, working by the light of a single bare bulb, building something that should have been impossible. Finch tightened the last connection and sat back, his spine crackling with stiffness. The device sat before him, ugly and improbable, a Frankenstein's monster of electronics. "Well," Emma whispered, "does it work?" Her father's hand hovered over the power switch. Everything hung on this moment. His career, his reputation, perhaps even the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. But mostly, he thought about the men drowning in icy water, the children going hungry, the slow strangulation of his country. He flipped the switch. The device hummed to life, and somewhere in the darkness of the Atlantic, the rules of the game began to change. Commander Peter Ashworth of the Royal Navy stood in the doorway of Finch's basement, his uniform crisp despite the early hour, his expression locked somewhere between disbelief and barely restrained anger. Behind him, two officers from the Admiralty's Technical Assessment Division exchanged skeptical glances. One of them, a younger man with wire-rimmed spectacles, wrinkled his nose at the smell of solder and stale tea that permeated the cramped space. "This is what you've been doing instead of reporting to your assigned post?" Ashworth's voice was clipped, precise, the tone of a man accustomed to order and proper procedure. "Professor Finch, I've been authorized to inform you that your security clearance is under review, and if you cannot provide a compelling reason—" "It works," Finch interrupted, gesturing toward the device on his workbench. Under the harsh light of morning, it looked even more absurd than it had the night before, a nest of wires and scavenged parts that seemed to mock the very concept of military engineering. The officer with spectacles stepped closer, peering at the device with academic curiosity. "What exactly is it supposed to work at, Professor?" "Detecting U-boats without being detected in return." Finch's voice was hoarse from lack of sleep, but steady. "Gentlemen, our current radar operates at 1.5 meters wavelength. The German Metox receivers can hear it coming from 20 miles away, giving U-boats ample time to dive and evade. What I've built here is a 10-centimeter radar transmitter and receiver. The Metox is blind to it." Ashworth's expression didn't change. "The boffins at TRE have been working on centimetric radar for over a year. They've assured us it's at least 18 months from field deployment. Because they're trying to build it properly, from the ground up, with new components and extensive testing." Finch picked up his device, cradling it like a newborn child. "I built it from salvage in 6 weeks. Is it elegant?" "No," Is it reliable? Probably not for long. But does it work? That's what I'm asking you to let me prove. The three officers exchanged looks. The young one with spectacles spoke up. Even if your frequencies are correct, and I'm skeptical they could be, given these components, you'd need to test it against an actual U-boat detection scenario. The nearest suitable test range is HMS Peregrine, Emma interrupted from the corner where she'd been sitting quietly. All eyes turned to her. She met their gaze steadily. The Naval Air Station at Ford. They run anti-submarine patrols daily. If my father's device works, you could mount it in a Sunderland flying boat and test it on an actual patrol. Ashworth studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Finch. You realize what you're asking? To install an unauthorized, untested device in a military aircraft on an active combat patrol. I'm asking for one flight, Finch said. One patrol. If it doesn't work, you can court-martial me, revoke my clearance, throw me in the Tower of London for all I care. But if it does work... He let the implication hang in the air. The silence stretched out. Through the basement's high window, pale winter sunlight filtered down, illuminating motes of dust that swirled like tiny galaxies. Somewhere above, the city was waking up, shopkeepers sweeping broken glass from their storefronts, mothers queuing for rationed bread, workers heading to factories that built the instruments of war. Commander Ashworth made his decision. One flight. Tomorrow morning. But I'm coming with you, Professor. If this device causes any danger to the aircraft or crew, I'll personally see to it that you never work in government service again. 24 hours later, Finch found himself climbing into the rear compartment of a short Sunderland flying boat, his precious device wrapped in canvas and cradled in his arms like forbidden cargo. The aircraft sat in the pre-dawn darkness at Ford, its engines already warming with a bone-deep rumble that he felt in his chest. The crew, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and 3 gunners, watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. They knew he wasn't regular Navy. They didn't know why he was there, and that made them suspicious. Flight Lieutenant Jack Morrison, the aircraft commander, was a lean man with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too many friends fail to return from patrol. He stood with arms crossed as Finch and a reluctant ground technician worked to install the device in the aircraft's electronics bay. "Let me understand this correctly," Morrison said, his northern accent thick with skepticism. "You want me to turn off our standard radar, the only thing between us and a surprise U-boat attack, and trust your... what did you call it?" "Modified centimetric detection set," Finch replied, making a final connection. "And yes. Based on what testing?" "Based on electromagnetic theory and 6 weeks of basement engineering." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Brilliant. And if we stumble onto a U-boat wolfpack with your contraption instead of our proper radar, what then?" Finch straightened, meeting the pilot's gaze. "Then we'll be the first aircraft to see them before they see us. We'll have the advantage of surprise. That's worth something, isn't it?" "It's worth our lives if you're wrong." "It's worth hundreds of lives if I'm right." The 2 men stared at each other in the growing light. Finally, Morrison nodded curtly. "Strap in, Professor. And pray to whatever God you believe in that your scrap heap doesn't get my boys killed." The Sunderland lifted off as dawn broke over the channel, its 4 Bristol Pegasus engines hauling the massive flying boat into a sky streaked with orange and gold. Finch sat wedged between the radio operator's station and the navigator's table, his device secured to the aircraft's frame with salvaged cargo straps, its jury-rigged display showing only static and electronic noise. Commander Ashworth sat across from him, stone-faced, occasionally checking his watch. The flight plan would take them west along the convoy routes, then south toward the Bay of Biscay, prime hunting grounds for U-boats transiting to and from their French bases. For the first hour, nothing. The device hummed its electric song, the display showed meaningless patterns, and Finch felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on him, waiting for him to fail. The radio operator, a young man named Davies, kept stealing glances at the device, his expression a mixture of fascination and doubt. "How does it work, then?" Davies finally asked, his curiosity overcoming his skepticism. Finch explained as best he could over the engine noise, describing wavelengths and frequencies, detection and reflection, the fundamental principle that metal objects could be seen at a distance by the radio waves that bounced off them. Davies listened, nodding occasionally, and gradually the other crew members leaned in to hear. "So the Jerry's Metox," Davies said slowly. "It's listening for our regular radar, yeah? But this thing, it's speaking in a different language entirely." "Exactly." Finch felt a small surge of hope. Maybe they were beginning to understand. "But what if there are no U-boats out here today?" the navigator asked. "Bit of a wasted trip, innit?" Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom from the cockpit. "We'll find something. We always do in this sector. Question is whether the professor's gadget spots it before." He was interrupted by a sudden change in the device's display. The random static resolved into a distinct pattern, a sharp echo, clear and unmistakable, bearing 270 degrees, range approximately 12 miles. Finch's heart hammered against his ribs. "Contact," he breathed. Then louder, "Contact! Bearing 270, 12 miles. Morrison's voice came back instantly. "All business now. Davies, any radar returns on conventional set?" The radio operator checked his standard equipment. "Negative, sir. Nothing showing. Visual." The forward gunner scanned the horizon through his position's windows. "Clear sky, sir. No surface contacts visible." Ashworth leaned forward, staring at Finch's device. "You're certain? Look at the return." Finch pointed to the display, his finger trembling with excitement and fear. "That's a solid metallic object, relatively small, sitting at the surface. It's exactly what a U-boat looks like on centimetric radar." Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom again, and now there was something different in his tone, a predatory edge. "All crew, action stations. We're going hunting. Professor, you better be right about this." The Sunderland banked hard to port, engines growling as Morrison pushed them to combat speed. The nose dipped slightly, and through the cockpit windows, Finch could see the gray Atlantic spread out below, deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Somewhere down there, a U-boat commander stood on his conning tower, believing himself invisible, believing his Metox would warn him of any danger, believing he was the hunter and not the prey. Finch watched his device, tracking the contact as it grew stronger. 10 miles. 8 miles. 6 miles. Still nothing on conventional radar? Morrison asked. "Still nothing, sir," Davies confirmed. "But the professor's gear is getting a strong return now. Very strong. 4 miles. The U-boat would be visible to the naked eye soon, if they were looking in the right direction." Morrison called to his forward gunner. "Tommy, bearing 270, about 4 miles. Tell me what you see." A pause. Then, "Jesus Christ, sir. I see it. Conning tower, periscope, deck gun. Type 7 by the look of it. She's just sitting there on the surface, bold as brass. Does she know we're here?" "No sign of it, sir. No crash dive, no movement at all." Morrison's voice was tight with controlled excitement. "Bomb bay doors open. Depth charges armed. Davies, start transmitting on all frequencies. Let the Jerry know he's about to have a very bad day." What happened next unfolded with the terrible beauty of a choreographed disaster. The Sunderland roared in at 200 feet, its sudden appearance catching the U-boat completely by surprise. Finch caught a glimpse through the cockpit window of men scrambling on the submarine's deck, tiny figures diving for the hatch, the gun crew abandoning their weapon in pure panic. The conning tower began to dip as the boat attempted an emergency dive, but it was far too late. 4 depth charges dropped in perfect sequence, disappearing into the ocean in neat splashes. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the water erupted, 4 massive fountains of white water and fury, lifting the U-boat's stern clear out of the ocean. The submarine hung there for a surreal moment, propellers spinning uselessly in air, before crashing back down into a sea now boiling with violence. Morrison pulled the Sunderland into a tight climbing turn, circling back to assess the damage. Where the U-boat had been, there was now only debris, wooden planking, oil, and growing patches of air bubbles rising from below. The intercom crackled with the crew's excited voices, overlapping each other. "Direct hit. She's going down. Did you see that stern lift?" But Finch wasn't listening to them. He was staring at his device, watching as the solid contact on the display fragmented and faded, replaced by weaker, scattered returns from sinking wreckage. He'd done it. The impossible, improvised, scrap-built detector had worked. It had given them eyes that could see in the dark, had turned the hunter into the hunted, had proven that Britain's best chance in the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't elegant engineering or endless committee meetings. It was desperate innovation and the courage to try. Commander Ashworth sat back in his seat, his expression stunned. "My God," he whispered. "It actually worked." The proof-of-concept success sparked a firestorm. Within hours of HMS Peregrine's patrol report hitting the Admiralty, Finch found himself standing in a commandeered conference room in Portsmouth, facing a gallery of skeptical faces, high-ranking naval officers, civilian scientists from the Telecommunications Research Establishment, Ministry of Supply bureaucrats, and one particularly hostile engineer named Dr. Edmund Blackwood, who'd spent the last 18 months leading the official centimetric radar project. "Gentlemen's luck," Blackwood was saying, his voice dripping with academic contempt. "One successful intercept proves nothing. For all we know, the U-boat was already damaged, or the crew was incompetent, or, Commander Ashworth interrupted sharply, Professor Finch's device did exactly what he claimed it would do. I was there, Blackwood. I saw it with my own eyes. Under completely uncontrolled conditions." Blackwood's face flushed red. This hodgepodge of salvaged components violates every principle of proper engineering. There's been no systematic testing, no quality control, no documentation of specifications. We don't even know if it can be reliably reproduced. "Then let's reproduce it," Finch said quietly. All eyes turned to him. He stood, placing both hands flat on the table. "Give me access to a proper workshop, a team of technicians, and 3 weeks. I'll build 20 units. We'll install them in Coastal Command aircraft and run operational patrols. If they work, and they will, then we push for mass production. If they don't, I'll resign and you can go back to your 18-month development schedule." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Everyone understood what Finch was really saying. 3 weeks versus 18 months, while U-boats sent hundreds more ships to the bottom. The moral weight of that choice hung in the air like smoke. Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke. "The professor's proposal has merit. We cannot afford to ignore a potential game-changer simply because it doesn't follow proper procedure." He fixed Blackwood with a hard stare. "Your team continues its work on the permanent solution. But we run Finch's field trial in parallel. If his version buys us 6 months of operational capability before your system is ready, that's 6 months of dead U-boats instead of dead merchantmen." Blackwood opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded stiffly, but the look he gave Finch promised that this argument was far from over. The workshop they provided was a converted aircraft hangar at RAF Tangmere, its cavernous interior lined with workbenches, tool racks, and crates of salvaged electronics. Finch's team grew organically, a mix of military technicians, civilian engineers deemed too old for combat duty, and even 2 women's auxiliary Air Force radio operators who proved to have surprisingly deft hands with delicate circuit work. Emma became his unofficial logistics coordinator, tracking down components from bomb-damaged buildings across southern England. She developed a network of salvage yard contacts, factory foremen, and Royal Engineers demolition teams who knew where to find specific parts in the urban wreckage. Need capacitors? There's a bombed telephone exchange in Southampton. Vacuum tubes? A destroyed cinema in Brighton still has its sound system partially intact. Wire coils? Every downed German bomber was a treasure trove of repurposable electronics. But as Finch and his team worked 16-hour days, a darker race was unfolding across the Channel. German naval intelligence had begun to notice something troubling in their Atlantic reports. U-boats were being surprised on the surface with increasing frequency, attacked by Allied aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere, with no warning from the METOX receivers. At first, commanders blamed equipment failure or operator error. But as the incidents multiplied, a more disturbing possibility emerged. The British had developed something new. In a windowless office beneath Berlin's Turpitzufer, Captain Zur C. Werner Hartmann studied a map covered with red pins marking successful Allied attacks on German submarines. The pattern was undeniable. Something had changed in the past 3 weeks. "They've found a way around the METOX," he said to his intelligence officer. "A detection system we can't hear." "That should be impossible, Herr Captain. Our scientists assure us that." "Our scientists are wrong." Hartmann's finger stabbed at the map. "Look at the attack pattern. Sudden interceptions, no warning, always from aircraft. They're using a new radar frequency. We need to capture one of their aircraft, intact, and examine its equipment." The order went out through encrypted channels to U-boat commanders and Luftwaffe fighter units. Priority targets were now British maritime patrol aircraft. Bring one down where the wreckage could be recovered. Find out what they're using. Back at Tangmere, Finch was unaware of the manhunt he'd inadvertently triggered. He was too focused on solving a critical problem: reliability. His original device had worked brilliantly for that one patrol, but subsequent testing revealed alarming inconsistencies. Some units functioned perfectly. Others experienced signal degradation, power fluctuations, or complete failures after a few hours of operation. "It's the vacuum tubes," one of his technicians explained, holding up a burnt-out tube salvaged from a cinema. "They were never designed for this kind of application. The heat, the vibration in an aircraft, the power surges, half of them are failing within the first 20 flight hours." Finch stared at the testing bench, where 3 of his devices sat in various states of disassembly. This was the nightmare scenario, a brilliant concept hobbled by inadequate components. They could build the detectors, but they couldn't make them reliable enough for extended combat operations. "We need mil-spec tubes," Emma said, reading the despair on her father's face. "Specifically manufactured for aircraft use." "Which requires going through official procurement channels," Finch replied bitterly. "Which means requisition forms, approval committees, 6-week delivery schedules." Or, one of the WAAF operators interrupted, "We ask Flight Lieutenant Morrison." Everyone turned to look at her. She shrugged. "He's not the only Coastal Command pilot who's heard about what happened on that patrol. Word gets around. And pilots talk. Some of them might be willing to repurpose tubes from damaged aircraft if it means they get one of these detectors." It was completely against regulations. It could result in court-martial. It would involve cannibalization of military equipment without authorization. Finch looked around at his team, at their tired faces, their sawdust-stained hands, their determination despite the odds. "Do it," he said. Within a week, a quiet underground network had formed. Coastal Command pilots and ground crews began siphoning vacuum tubes from aircraft waiting for repair, from spare parts inventories, from anywhere they could justify the loss in paperwork. The tubes arrived at Tangmere in anonymous canvas bags, no questions asked, No official records created. It was theft, technically. It was also the only way forward. The improved detectors began rolling out to operational squadrons. 210 Squadron, 228 Squadron, 461 Squadron. Each aircraft equipped with Finch's device became a silent hunter, prowling the Atlantic with eyes that could see the unseeable. U-boat kill rates began to climb. The Germans started keeping their submarines submerged longer, burning precious battery power, reducing their operational effectiveness. And then, on a cold morning in March 1943, the gamble almost collapsed entirely. A Liberator from 120 Squadron, equipped with one of Finch's detectors, was jumped by 4 Ju-88 fighters over the Bay of Biscay. The engagement was brutal and one-sided. The Liberator's gunners fought back desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. One by one, the bomber's engines caught fire. The pilot, knowing his aircraft was doomed, made a final decision. Rather than ditch in the ocean where the wreckage might be recovered by German vessels, he aimed for the French coast, hoping to crash-land in a location where the resistance might reach the wreckage first. The Liberator came down in a field near Lorient, breaking apart on impact. 3 crew members survived. They were captured within hours. But in the chaos of the crash, partisan forces managed to reach the wreckage first, pulling out pieces of equipment before German troops arrived. Among those pieces was the targeting housing containing Finch's detector, its circuits melted and its components scattered, but potentially still identifiable. The intelligence reached Tangmere through coded radio transmissions from occupied France. The resistance could try to smuggle the remnants out, but it would take time and resources. And there was no guarantee that the Germans hadn't already examined the wreckage. Finch stood in the hangar that had become his second home, staring at a half-assembled detector on his workbench. Around him, his team had stopped working, waiting to see how he would react. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. If the Germans recovered and analyzed his device, they'd understand the frequency shift. Within weeks, they'd develop a new receiver that could detect centimetric radar. The advantage would evaporate. All of this, the salvage, the long hours, the risks, the dead U-boats, would be rendered obsolete. Emma approached him quietly. "What do we do?" Finch was silent for a long moment, thinking. Then, slowly, a fierce determination settled over his features. "We accelerate. If they're going to reverse engineer our detector, then we need to make it widespread enough, quickly enough, that even if they develop a counter, we've already done maximum damage to their U-boat fleet. We go from 20 units to 200. Every coastal command aircraft, every convoy escort, every hunter-killer group. We flood the Atlantic with centimetric radar before the Germans can respond." "That's impossible," one of the technicians said. "We don't have the resources, the personnel." "Then we find them." Finch's voice was hard, unyielding. "Every aircraft repair depot in Britain becomes a production site. Every technician who can solder a circuit board joins the effort. We work around the clock. We cut corners. We take risks. Because the alternative is that men keep dying while we follow proper procedure." Ashworth had been standing in the hangar's entrance, listening. Now he stepped forward. "I'll talk to the Air Ministry. If you can show me a credible production plan, I'll fight to get you the authorization." "No." Finch shook his head. "No authorization. No committee approval. We just start. Build the detectors, install them in aircraft, let the results speak for themselves. By the time the bureaucrats realize what we're doing, there'll be too many units in the field to recall. They'll have to accept it as a fait accompli." It was insubordination. It was career suicide. It was exactly what the situation demanded. Ashworth studied Finch for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that, Professor. But if anyone asks, I'll testify that your detectors have saved lives. That should count for something at your court-martial." "I'll settle for it, counting in the Battle of the Atlantic," Finch replied. And so began the most desperate month of Professor Harold Finch's life. Sleep became a luxury measured in stolen hours. Food was whatever could be eaten while working. The hangar at Tangmere transformed into a 24-hour production line, with shifts of workers building, testing, installing. Detectors left the facility in the backs of trucks, headed for airfields across Britain, each one representing a small act of technological rebellion against the official chain of command. The Germans, meanwhile, were conducting their own desperate analysis. In a laboratory in Paris, captured pieces of the Liberator's equipment sat on examination tables, photographed from every angle, subjected to X-ray analysis and chemical testing. German scientists argued over circuit diagrams, trying to understand how the British had achieved frequency modulation with such primitive components. "It's clever," one scientist admitted reluctantly. "Crude, yes. Inelegant, certainly. But clever. They've sacrificed reliability and precision for speed of deployment." "Can we counter it?" his supervisor demanded. "Given time and resources, yes. We'd need to develop a new receiver with broader frequency sensitivity. 3 months, perhaps 4. You have 6 weeks. The Führer is demanding results." The race was on. British production versus German counter-development. Improvised engineering versus systematic analysis. And hanging in the balance, the lives of thousands of sailors and the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. In his hangar at Tangmere, Finch worked through another sleepless night, his hands moving with mechanical precision as he assembled yet another detector from salvaged parts. Around him, his team did the same, a small army of engineers and technicians fighting their own private war. Outside, dawn was breaking over a world at war. And somewhere in the Atlantic, a U-boat commander surfaced his vessel, unaware that the rules had changed, that the hunter had become the hunted, that his Metox receiver was useless against the flood of centimetric radar now sweeping the waves. The device on Finch's workbench hummed to life. He tested the signal strength, verified the frequency modulation, checked the display one final time. Then he carefully packaged it for transport, added it to the growing stack of completed units, and immediately began work on the next one.